mentioned at the end of my questioning of Mr. Smith that it seems that when you have a data broker, a big data broker, or companies like this that have very, just what, 10% of their business is consumer facing, the rest is just data stored or marketed to companies, that they seem less incentivized to actually protect consumers because they just don't face them that much. Is that a problem in your view?
Yes, I agree with you. When you asked Mr. Smith about whether or not Equifax had a culture of cybersecurity, he answered in the affirmative, but nothing seems to back that up. Whether it's the putting a whole patch management system on an individual and having a lot of that rest on that person.
The person's name is Gus, I think.
Yes, yes,
Right?
poor Gus.
Yeah,
Let's think
yeah.
of him. And whether it's about Gus or whether it's about how you take care of people and how you are considering them. I don't remember who it was on the subcommittee mentioned that the people were a product in this case and not considered customers. Ranking Member Franken, thank you. Yes. I see that as a big problem.
So I would just add one particular thing. I mean, I think it's clear that it dulls their incentive for investment over and above the externalities I talked about. I would also say that it gives me pause and concern about the proposed unlock lock feature, because if that were to be widely deployed, that's something that would need to go to consumers. And for a company who collects data on consumers but does not have direct relationships with consumers, I'm not sure how effective the verification and authentication mechanisms could be in that case.
What does, for companies that do this right, this privacy right, what does it look like? You kind of give a sketch of a company like this, like the ones we're talking about, these data brokers. What would proper security measures look like?
It comes into this culture that you mentioned. When companies build security into the design and development of their products, so they're thinking about security as they're making new products, they don't expect to just bolt it on at the end. Bolt-on security never works very well.
So some of these measures that they offered in the end after the breach
were a little hasty.
Right. So those should be put in place, or have more of those things in place beforehand.
Sure. Sure. Or valuing people, supporting them enough so it's not just one person that has to deal with patching or encrypting data, or there are a lot of different pieces.
On that same line, Mr. Moore, when they found, or that they should have, what should they have found when Gus failed to provide the patch? I mean, he was saying it was human failure followed by technical failure. What would proper security look like?
Well, I think what you would see is a step of sort of identification of the assets you have. If you look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, the very first step is identify, right? So an organization who has their cybersecurity house in order should be able to identify quite robustly the configuration of all of their systems, what the software configurations are, and then from there be able to react to the announcements of vulnerability disclosures very quickly to apply patches to fix the problem. So I think step one is to do a better job of identification, but it carries all the way through to whenever a breach occurs to be prepared for the response so that you're ready in the event that an adverse event happens.
At least additional protocols should be put in place to follow on after human failure with another human check, perhaps, and are there industry standards that have been adopted, or best practices that others use that should be instructive here or not?
I would start with the NIST cybersecurity framework as a guiding set of principles for how to approach the cybersecurity risks within an organization. That's where I would begin.
All right. Thank you. My time's expired. Mr. Moore, you discussed societal harms by these large-scale data breaches, not only to individual consumers, but to the economy as a whole. How do consumers' habits change after a breach, and how might that affect the economy generally?
Well, I mean, I think they're sort of the direct potential harms, that people might have less access to credit because they've wrongfully had their credit score degraded. That's one possibility. But what I worry about more is sort of these indirect costs where people overcorrect and sort of withdraw from the economy as a result. So, and maybe take steps that are not effective. So when I was going to the airport yesterday, I talked to my Uber driver about what I was doing. And he said that since the Equifax breach, he was afraid to anymore back up his personal data off of his phone, his smartphone, out to the cloud, because it might have sensitive information. And so that's concerning to me when I hear statements like that, because in fact, he should be backing up his data, because there is a very real risk that he might lose his phone and that would cause him harms. But he's taking a step, which is to try to in reaction to this breach, which could actually harm him in the long run. So that's an example of an indirect cost that I worry about. And in the aggregate, this could actually be quite problematic.
Well, thank you. You have